UrbanTalk would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. We recognise and we celebrate our continued connection to country, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Planning Congress podcast. In partnership with the Planning Institute of Australia, UrbanTalk is once again hosting a special podcast series in the lead up to the 2025 National Planning Congress that will take place in Darwin, Garramilla country between May 28 and 30. Through this podcast, we'll bring you interviews with key local and international speakers so that you can get a taste of what to expect at Congress. My name is Belinda Barnett and I am the podcast host. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Ross Elliott. Ross has over 35 years' experience in property and urban development and is a frequent writer and guest speaker on urban development themes in Australia and the United States. Ross is a passionate advocate for suburban renewal, is a founding director of the policy group Suburban Futures, and in 2018 was asked by the Lord Mayor of Brisbane to chair the Suburban Renewal Program, the Better Suburbs Initiative, along with Guy Gibson, who will also be appearing on an upcoming episode of the UrbanTalk podcast. Ross co-edited The Next Australian City, which documents Australia's suburban evolution and is an excellent read. At Congress, Ross will be part of the plenary panel session, Planning for the Housing We Need, which will also feature Anthony Burke, host of Grand Designs Australia, and Anthony is also going to be a guest on an upcoming podcast. But today with Ross, I am going to talk about the challenges facing Australian suburbs. Ross, I want to start by thanking you and Suburban Futures for sponsoring keynote speaker Ellen Dunham-Jones, who is going to be talking at Congress about suburban retrofitting. Ellen appeared on our previous podcast, which I recommend to our listeners, and Ellen spoke with me about how past century suburbs, shopping malls and parking lots across the United States are being reinvented into vital and prosperous spaces for future generations. Ellen, together with June Williamson, has co-authored 2 books about retrofitting and urban design solutions. Ellen and June are held in high acclaim as the movers and shakers of suburban retrofitting, having researched around 2,500 suburban retrofit projects across the US. And I know that you, like me, are a huge fan of her work. I want to start by asking you, do you think retrofitting is a viable approach in Australia for suburban renewal? And what does an Australian suburban retrofit model look like? I know that's a big question to put out there at once.
Thanks, Belinda. Look, I think why we were originally attracted so much to the work that Ellen and her co-author June Williamson have done is that it is so obviously applicable to so many parts of Australia. So I think we're starting this journey of looking at suburban renewal. America's probably a lot more advanced and they've got more examples that they can share. And that's exactly what they've done in their book, Retrofitting Suburbia. And then the follow-up book was called Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia. So I'm envious because you keep turning the page and there's another project. And I say, if only we had that sort of thing here. So where does this potentially happen in our country? Well, across the suburbs, there are many areas where typically industry has moved out or simply changed its location needs, right? So smaller industrial buildings or precincts, typically sawtooth roof era, narrow, small streets, B-doubles can't navigate those locations anymore. They've moved to areas that are more freight friendly, more transport distribution friendly. So they've left behind what I would call a legacy land use or zoning, right? And often we've tried to protect those legacy land uses, thinking that perhaps one day that industry will come back, but it's not going to, let's face it. What we ought to be doing instead is looking at how we can adapt and create opportunities for a greater variety of uses to re-inhabit those spaces in our suburbs and to bring with it back the density, particularly of employment, not just housing, but the employment density that some of those buildings used to provide. Now, I know there's many industrial sheds in Brisbane where hundreds of people back in the day used to go to work with their sandwich box and overhead pneumatic drills, and they're all cheek by jowl, lined up in the factory making stuff. Hundreds of people. These days, some of those buildings are used to store boxes, and there might be 2 people working in the entire building that once housed hundreds. So if we can put that employment density of use back into those locations, I think we're on a winner. A couple of examples come to mind. Nunda Village in Brisbane is, I think, a great example of what was a rundown suburban precinct, a little village neighbourhood. Since a road bypass was put in place, the council changed some planning laws, and the private investors moved in and redeveloped a great deal of it. We've now got new shops, renewed pubs offering gastro meals, all that sort of stuff, and an influx of medical professionals that have come into the precinct. So it's got its vibe back. In Sydney, I think of somewhere like the grounds of Alexandria, which just blows me away. I mean, and you know what's interesting about that? This is an old industrial building. Parts of it, I think, used to be a tannery. Everything toxic took place on that place, that site. Now it's a place where people go for functions, weddings, just to visit. But it's surrounded by fairly new or reasonably recent industrial buildings. There's not a lot of full east sides around there, so it's still a viable industrial precinct. And in the middle of it sits this incredible facility that the community is drawn to. 15 or 20,000 people a week, I understand. And at one stage, it was in the top 10 most Instagrammed places in Australia. So, I mean, that to me is a great example. And if you look at Melbourne, the one that I always laugh about a little bit, in that it was a kind of former very high long-term housing in the former Pentridge prison. Uh, it's now been converted into a range of mixed uses, but also housing. But they've included, incredibly, a childcare centre there in the grounds, which kind of you think, well, if you want your kids to be safe, that mightn't be such a bad idea. But there's a use where it was obviously sort of quasi-industrial, those very large, foreboding, dark stone walls, and it's been turned into what I would call quite an exciting project in the suburbs. So we've got some examples, Linda. Not as many as I'd like, but there are some.
Well, it's good to hear that we are really reinventing mixed use. And when it comes to the prison, it's certainly a new take on a gated community. What I love about Suburban Futures is that you are really concerned with getting a fairer deal for Australian suburbs. You know, you've shone a very big spotlight on the fact that in Australia, most urban renewal projects are being advanced by state governments, are being focused on inner city areas. I think you holding the view that really government policy hasn't really been in touch with suburbia. Given that most Australians want to live in suburbs, and I know you've got all the stats on this, so please share them, and that most Australians work in our suburbs, why are they being overlooked by our policymakers? Shouldn't we be giving Australians what they want?
You always have to go all the way back to the old Better Cities program, which was launched under the Hawke Keating government. Brian Howe was the responsible minister, and a terrific bloke called Lindsay Nielsen ran the program. And that looked at rejuvenating rundown inner city areas, former industrial precincts. Same story. Yeah, they left. And we had a threat at the time as well of the hollowing out of the inner city. And this was something that was happening a lot in the US, in that the downtowns were being abandoned and people were moving further out. So it was an active program to rehabilitate those inner city areas under the Better Cities program. The first initiative in Brisbane was a partnership between the federal government and the local council to upgrade the main sewer. Not a very glamorous bit of infrastructure, but pretty important, right? And that and a few other things, a urban renewal task force led by Trevor Redcliffe and supported by then Mayor Jim Sawley, saw some of these old industrial areas like New Farm, Tenerife and so on turned completely on their head. I mean, they were once run down industrial precincts, a lot of homeless people, a lot of crime. They are now the most expensive places in all of Queensland, right? So gentrification complete, mission accomplished. You could say the same about Balmain in Sydney, or, the big places in Melbourne. They've got the same similar story, and other cities in Australia. But we spent, I think, probably the best part of 30 years focused on urban renewal as an inner urban proposition. In that time, we also had the Richard Florida schools of thought about the whole creative class were going to flock to inner cities, and we had to make them super amenable to attract the talent, and the global war on talent and all the rest of it. So we spent a lot of money improving the amenity of the infrastructure. Public money was supported by private capital, and these places, as I said, were completely turned around. In the meantime, whole areas of our suburban urbanism, if you like, were just left to fend for themselves. And I think it's a shame. So what we did with Suburban Futures was, so hang on a minute, if it's true that depending on where you want to draw the boundaries, but between 9 and 10 out of all people who might call the capital city region home actually live and work in the suburbs. Why aren't we taking everything we learned about inner city renewal and applying it to suburban locations? That's all. Now, for some people, I guess there was an idolization of the inner city. It was the Emerald City fascination and this sort of mythology that built up around the whole notion of inner city density and inner city activity and the centralized economy. And at the same time, the suburbs were kind of, it was a sort of disdain, a distaste, because this is where people ate fast food, drank fizzy drinks, sat and watched junk TV. They were poorly educated. They loved their cars. How terrible. And they lived in huge consumptive McMansions. I mean, every form of derision you could throw at the suburbs has been thrown at it. Elizabeth Farrelly, most famously, in a couple of quotes I won't repeat, showed her complete distaste for anything suburban. But I think we're moving on. Hopefully we're moving on. And the one thing, we've been on this theme for a long time, but what really changed the psyche was COVID. When people were forced, so people who used to inhabit inner city offices were told, don't come, stay at home, work from home, and they reconnected with their local village. Now they don't want to leave. Look how unpopular it is if you try mandate a return to the office, because people say, hang on, that's going to cost me time and money, and it's not even all that great when I get there because I just sit in a cubicle next to some other knucklehead who I don't even really want to be with. So, I'm just as productive at home, many of them will say. Whether they are or not, I don't know. There's an argument to be had. But I think that really changed a lot of the thinking about the suburbs. So we are still pushing for policymakers to understand that and to view suburban renewal in the same way that we looked at urban renewal. I think it's one of the great challenges of the century for Australian cities, and to bring jobs closer to where people live, which facilitates shorter commutes. Not just jobs, but also the social infrastructure they need, schools, hospitals, and all that sort of thing. And to retrofit some of those suburban precincts with a different type of housing choice. Yeah, it's a big challenge. It's a huge infrastructure challenge. But if you view this over the very long term, another 20 or 30 years, I think we can do for those suburban areas exactly what we've done in the inner city.
Yeah, it's a very exciting prospect. Yeah, I think planners sort of have really lost sight of the role that our suburbs play. When I was talking with Alan, I said to her, you're making suburbs sexy again, which I love. I think it's been very easy for planners to simply equate planning for our suburbs with suburban sprawl.
Well, sprawl is a pejorative term in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think the role of our suburbs should be? And I think, importantly, who should be championing their cause?
I think suburbs are already doing that. They house the most people and they provide the most jobs. They're under pressure, obviously. And I think part of that reflects our very high rate of population growth driven by immigration policy. It's moving at a speed we can't keep up with. We'll talk about that a bit more later. But I think, once we begin to understand that the CBD office tower is not the workplace of the majority. In fact, it's such a small minority of workers who work in CBD office towers in professional roles. The fastest growing industries are things like health and education. And guess what? You don't see many people in surgical gowns walking around the CBDs who are city. Those are jobs. Health and education are suburban jobs by their very nature. And then you've got retail, obviously, and wholesale businesses. You've got transport and warehousing, logistics, all the rest of it. These are nearly all occupations that are going to be looking for places in suburbia to be home. So once we have to get our head around the nature of the economy that we live in. There's a very deep-rooted myth that you hear all the time whenever there's talk of a new suburban housing estate on an exurban or outer suburban area, that all of those people over there are going to want to come here for work. Now, that's a debate driven by people who are inside the bubble, right? Inside, I think Bernard Salt called it the goat cheese curtain. So, they've got a prejudice. But when we've done the research, so people who live in outer suburban areas aren't forced out there because they can't afford to live in the inner city. They live out there because they work out there. So you'll find that, in the Southeast Queensland context, for example, people on the Sunshine Coast nearly all work on the Sunshine Coast. They don't want to work in inner city Brisbane, otherwise they live closer to where they work. I mean, people aren't stupid. And the people in the outer northern Moreton Bay area, they might work in the southern Moreton Bay. Southern Moreton Bay will work in northern Brisbane. So it's a chain gang effect. They're not commuting in the main long distances. In fact, it's only around between 5 and 10% of people in outer suburban areas in southeast Queensland who work in the inner city. And yet, politically, sometimes, we're driven by that myth that we must provide this very expensive, high-frequency mass transport system for all of those people out there to come in here. They don't. And this is why those projects often fail, because they're funded without, in spite of the evidence. In fact, Belinda, it's like an episode of Utopia. That's why it's so hard to watch that show. It's so true.
I will agree with you. So why aren't we getting the research? Why aren't state governments investing in this in the proper demographic research that is underpinning policy?
There's a great quote by John F. Kennedy before he was shot many, many years ago. It was in his inaugural speech. He said, we prefer, he said, it's about the myth. The myth is worse than the lie because the myth endures, whereas the lie is easy to pull apart. But he said in this quote, he said, we enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. And I think policy often is driven heavily by opinion. We don't bother to consult the evidence or look dispassionately at it and simply ask the question. It's scary how much of this happens in design professions, in urban planning, in development, in right across almost anything to do with our cities. We'll find that there are so-called truisms, which the moment you start to pick them apart, they fall apart. So the evidence is there. We have a census every 5 years, which provides us with more than enough answers to any questions if we can be bothered to ask the questions.
Yeah, and interpret the results, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the housing crisis, because at Congress you're going to be talking about, the panel discussion is all about the housing we urgently need across Australia and how it gets provided. In New South Wales, at least, government policy that promotes transit-orientated development seems to have become the panacea of the housing crisis. What are your thoughts about transit-orientated development, or TODs for short? Will TODs solve the Australian housing crisis?
It's great. No, and it's a little bit triggering for me because, I don't know, we've been talking about TODs for 30-something years and they keep getting flagged. I mean, classic case of overpromise and underdeliver, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
It's extraordinary. I guess there's a few things. One is that rail is not always the best neighbour to have. Rail organisations tend to want to be rail organisations, and they think about moving big trains full of freight or people. They don't have a development mindset. It's not what they do. Even though they're sitting on significant quantities of land that could be better used, they don't see that as their priority. And the other thing about TODs is, if you talk about the housing crisis, well, I actually say we have a growth crisis. So we have a crisis of shortage of everything, not just houses. But if you look at the concept of TODs, as I understand it in New South Wales, it's to build very high density apartment towers next to train stations. Well, the fact is that developing high density housing is the most expensive per square metre form of housing you can possibly deliver. So you are not going to solve the affordability problems in housing by building more of the most expensive stock, right? That's just basic maths ought to tell people that. Even politicians ought to be able to understand it. But, like I said, this is an episode of Utopia. We're living it. So that's a real problem. I think that the cost of those structures next to train stations is going to mean that only people with very high incomes are going to be able to afford to live there, unless they're massively subsidised by the taxpayer somehow. The other thing is, I think we make the mistake with TODs of always presuming that development around a station should be housing, because once again, that myth is that people will want to live there so they can get to that job in the CBD or the inner city. And for many people, that's simply not the case. What we're not doing much of is looking at the stations as a destination, not a place to get on the train, but a place to get off. So when you look at this overseas, Japan, much of Southeast Asia, it's not just housing around the train station. You can have schools. You could have hospitals. Schools are a great one because kids need to get back onto public transport. And mum and dad can stop ferrying them around our roads because it's adding to 25, 30% of the congestion is ferrying kids to school. So if we put the schools next to the train stations, we might start to ameliorate that massive problem. Hospitals, workplaces, other things. So the station as a destination, not as a place to embark, it seems like an opportunity we haven't explored. We just keep going back to the same idea that we'll solve the housing crisis or solve housing affordability by building the most expensive housing we can possibly manage around train stations to take people to places they don't really want to go. That's it in a nutshell, you know.
Yeah, you put it very, very well, and I love that fresh thinking about, train stations and looking upon them as destinations. That's a monumental shift in thinking, I think, for planners. To me, I can't help thinking that, when in response to the National Housing Accord, I mean, we really have these siloed housing policies that deal with TODs or deal with the missing middle. And you touched on it a little bit earlier, but we're not accompanying this policy drive by infrastructure planning. It's very, very one-sided. You can't help but question, is this the right approach for our suburbs? Surely we should be using a place-based approach.
Absolutely. I think, the problem in governments, the way we work is, let's say it's the health department and it comes to budget time. All of the minions will be working away on all of the projects that, they have identified a need for. That bubbles up through the layers of management. It gets to the director general level and then the ministerial level, and they will finesse that into their budget submission. They take that off to cabinet, and everyone sits around the cabinet table, and the premier or whoever sends them all back and says, you can cut that, but you can add this, and away they go, and back it comes. And then after 2 or 3 rounds of this, there's the budget. What doesn't happen is starting with the place-based outcome to say, all right, let's look at, I don't know, it could be a Penrith in Sydney or a Chermside in Brisbane or Caboolture in north of Brisbane, and to say, what do we need to do to make this place work better for the community? Right. This is what we need. We need this from health. We need this from education. We need this from transport. We need this from you and you guys over in planning, etc. And so the budgets are built around the place-based outcome instead of being built around a silo outcome, because what that means is that often the health budget and the transport budget might be at odds because someone wants to build a road where someone wants to build a hospital or you understand what I mean, let alone the intergovernmental. Don't know how to describe it. Shit show might be the technical word, because if we can't coordinate between departments at one level, or God help us for coordinating between local and state and federal.
Yeah.
I think definitely a place-based strategy is important. The old Better Cities program, in a way, was place-based, and I think there's room, in my view, for a federal better suburbs and regions strategy. And I know Pia has been calling on a national settlement strategy. As part of that, you would say, well, we should do this place-based and begin with looking at second-tier cities in Australia. Why aren't more employers going there? Why is it, for example, that the rate of payroll tax is the same if I was a larger employer here in Brisbane, where all the amenity and infrastructure is already present? It's the same rate of payroll tax as if I was to go put a business into a Gladstone or a Rockhampton or a Mount Isa or wherever. I mean, it's illogical. So we haven't really got our heads around how to best support place-based outcomes yet.
Yeah. And
hope springs eternal, though.
We can only live in hope. You touched on it, but it comes back, I think, to this whole spirit of collaboration. Local government, is often portrayed, when it comes to planning policy, as the villain, the obstructionist to achieving development outcomes. This is often used by state governments, I guess, as justification for top-down housing policy. Yet councils are the closest level of government to the people. How can we achieve better collaboration between local and state government when it comes to suburban renewal and housing policy?
I think partly the answer to that is, you first of all follow the money, because I think Keating once said, never stand between a treasurer and a bucket of money. And who has the money in Australia? It's the federal government. And ironically, it's the federal government, I would say, that's creating a lot of the challenge for state and local governments by record population growth driven entirely by immigration. Our rate of natural births over deaths is negative. I think the reproduction rate is 1.5 and it needs to be at 2 just to replace ourselves. So it's policy that's creating this huge wave of demand. Who's copping the blame for that? Well, state governments, and then even more so local governments. The issue for local governments is they get, in Queensland, wouldn't be much different elsewhere. They're only getting about 3 cents in the dollar of tax out of all the tax raised. So they go with begging bowls all the time. And yet they're the ones being tasked with with the responsibility to provide not just the housing, but all the other bits and pieces that go with it. And at the state government level, they're tasked with the responsibility for the schools and hospitals and major public transport and all the rest of it. And they likewise aren't getting the lion's share of money. In fact, you look right across the country, you've got an approach where the high growth outer suburban areas of the major capital cities that are being tasked with some of the greatest growth rates are the least funded, which is wrong. And you've got a thing called the National Growth Areas Alliance that operates in New South Wales and Victoria and elsewhere. And we've partnered with Bronwyn, who runs that show, a little bit because we're trying to raise awareness of the same problem here, that this can't go on. And nor can I think this raises that whole argument about NIMBYism, nor can you blame local governments for responding to community hostility. If you have a proposal to come into someone's neighbourhood or their street of traditional low-density housing, say we're now going to rezone this, it's all going to be missing middle or gentle density. That's a very Orwellian term, I think. The house is their biggest single investment. They don't trust their super. Can't blame them. Look at what happens. But the house is the one thing they control. It's the one key asset they've got. If you come after them with any proposal that risks changing the perceived value of that, they will come at you with pitchforks. So be prepared. I think it's too easy to dismiss that as NIMBYism. I don't know that the industry has done a good a job as it could in explaining what's proposed, how long it will take for change to take effect, what the impacts will be at the local level, and so on. So the community's not sold. They've seen too many examples of poor development. They respond by saying to their local councillor, no. It's not NIMBYism. They're just saying, we look after ourselves here. If that councillor defies the community and says we're going to do it anyway, then the councillor is voted out. The next councillor that comes along will look at the one who was voted out and say, I'm not going near that idea, because you become even more entrenched over time. And that part of me also argues that that's why I think suburban renewal as an opportunity for housing and other mixed uses is a good idea, because as far as I've been able to see, the community don't object to a rundown old industrial area, which has more rats than people in it, being converted into a mixed use environment of living, shopping, entertainment, retail, all of the rest of it. It's not impacting them. It's actually adding to their community value. But go into their street or go into their neighbourhood where they live with proposed planning changes, and however you want to call it, and whatever Orwellian term, they're not stupid. So you've just got to understand their hostility. So that's reflected at the local council level. As you say, closest to the people. That's what we're seeing right across the country. But I think the real culprits in this, to my mind, are the federal government. They have all the money and they're creating most of the problem, and they're not helping. And the latest efforts in housing policy are just, let's face it, an embarrassment, I think, on both sides. We could do so much better.
You started at the outset talking about some of your favourite suburban renewal projects, like the Grounds and Pentridge Prison. And what are some of the key lessons, I guess, that planners can take away from these projects to start thinking about and putting in place policies for successful urban renewal in their areas?
We tend to try lock in land uses, and we tend to have this habit of colouring inside the lines and micro thinking what we would like the outcome to be on a particular site in a particular precinct. Now, that one's coloured blue and this one over here is coloured green. The world doesn't work like that. And I think some of the most innovative solutions we've seen are the ones that kind of ignore the rules. I've often said that the best parts of our cities are the accidental parts that were created before we had all these rules. They're so good that we want to preserve them.
Yeah.
These are the historical precincts where stuff was just allowed to happen. People just did it. So I think within some of our planning regimes, there's too much prescription, too much control, too much trying to influence particular outcomes on particular sites. The real world, the private world, if you like, is moving way faster than regulation. In fact, you'll never get innovation through regulation. The more regulation you apply, the more you stifle innovation. So in theory, the less regulation, the more you'll stimulate innovation. And there's loads of private capital. There is no shortage. So why aren't we thinking about how better to attract and deploy private capital for public benefit? And often that means a wider field of opportunities for that private capital to work within than we can possibly do through regulation. The other problem with regulation is once it's in place, it's out of date. And then we say we can't get around to updating this for 10 or 15 years. So we've got right across the country, we've got planning schemes that have been in place before the damn iPhone. That's how old this stuff is, how irrelevant it is to modern life. Completely irrelevant. And yet we're saying, but that's the rule book. I was like, well, the rule book is bullshit. It's just not helping anyone. And it's an embarrassment that we still cling to some of this outmoded thinking. So my advice, I guess, and that would be introduce as much flexibility as we can, try to be much less prescriptive, and work much closer with private capital to generate those private outcomes, those public outcomes, sorry. Because in my view, when you look at the grounds at Alexandria, the Pentridge Prison, Nunda Village, I mean, there are examples, many more than that. West Village in Brisbane, a brilliant redevelopment. This was all done by private capital, where originally the planning schemes might have said, no, that can't possibly happen. You can't, grounds of Alexandria, right? You can't put high amenity little sort of dining wedding venue type place that's smack in the middle of industrial. Let's just don't be stupid. But look at what's happened. It's there and it works extremely well. So yeah, less rules, I think, Linda.
Well, I certainly support that one. So just lastly, it seems to me that if we are to have great Australian cities, we need great suburbs. So in your current role, what is your vision for our suburban future?
We at Suburban Futures, we just have a strap line. It says better suburbs equals better cities. You can't create two clusters of city, the poor downtrodden suburbanite putting up with second grade amenity versus the high end, luxury amenity for all of the inner city types. We want to see that spread more equitably around the place so that people who live and work in the suburbs who've got similar access to high quality infrastructure, amenity, better public places. We've got cities that are littered with parks that are mostly used by the mowing contractor. There's been no investment in them to make them places where people want to go and play. I'd love to see a lot of our older industrial, commercial, or even shopping centre precincts completely reimagined because they sit on some very well located land and they could allow completely different uses there that are of more value to the community than an empty old post-war shed storing boxes. I'd like to see all of that happen. I'd like to see our parks and our creek corridors. Creeks are great urban connectors, but we tend to just put fences around them because apparently we want to fall in them all the time. But they could be rehabilitated for a much better environmental outcome than being used as a tip. And they make great active transport corridors. So there's all manner of things. It's not just built form. It's about working on the suburban environment in some of these public places as well. And the acid test will be one day if someone, you've got two people and one lives in a nice inner city, Vaucluse type, Rose Bay area, and another lives in an outer area, Parramatta or Penrith, right, for the Sydney example, or Chermside or Caboolture in a Brisbane example. And the two people both love where they are and basically have access to very similar standards of amenity and quality of life. That to me is the acid test. Not where one is moaning about no access to X, Y, Z, and the other has X, Y, Z in spades. That would be the outcome.
Well, thank you, and I share that vision. Ross, it's been great talking with you today. You've raised some amazing ideas and concepts and inspired us to be much more innovative in our approach. It's fantastic that Suburban Futures is putting our suburbs back in the spotlight. Before doing this podcast, I'll be honest, I wasn't familiar with Suburban Futures, so I've learned a whole lot about your organisation, and I know that other people listening to the podcast will as well, and they'll be excited to talk with you at Congress. The plenary session that you're going to be part of on planning for the housing we need should not want to be missed. As you will have gleaned from this podcast, there is an incredible wealth of experience and insights that we will all learn from participating in this panel discussion. And so, Ross, thank you once again. If you haven't been to Congress before, I encourage you all to seize the moment and make your way to Darwin. Set aside the 28th to the 30th of May 2025 in your diary, escape the cooler weather and head to Congress. Why not stay a few more days in Darwin and go barramundi fishing? I can personally recommend that experience. Just keep an eye on those crocodiles. It really is a great adventure. To learn more, go to the Congress events page on the PIA website. If you have any questions, please email congress@planning.org.au. To hear more episodes from our Planning Congress podcast series or to listen to our regular podcast, follow the UrbanTalk podcast feed in your app of choice and leave a review to help others find the podcast. If you're a developer or planner looking to have an online presence or need help with community engagement, then get in touch with us at urbantalk.com.au. I'm Belinda Barnett, and thank you for listening to the 2025 Planning Congress podcast. The next Australian city, The Suburban Evolution, edited by Guy Gibson and Ross Elliott, is available for $39.95 from connorcourtpublishing.com.au. Get your copy today.